Now, before we move on to integrating our view stores nearby button, let's go ahead and make sure that everything that we have done so far has all the correct information. So in our case, this looks good, right? We are rendering different coffee stores based on a latitude and longitude. But if we click on one of these, we should also see the data associated to these stores, such as the image, neighborhood, address, and so on. Now, if we click on hot black coffee, notice how there is nothing getting rendered here. We only see one, but remember, one was hard coded. These two values are not getting rendered. So let's make sure if it's just this coffee store or if it's some other coffee store as well. Now let's click on Coffee Office and the same thing. That means when we integrated our coffee store library, we did break something. It did not work as intended. It did for our home page, but not for our individual coffee store page. So let's go ahead and fix that and let's start debugging it. Now, if we go back to our individual coffee store page, which is this page right here, we will notice that all the way to the bottom, we have address, neighborhood getting printed right here, right? And if you scroll all the way to the top, we are actually showing it from props.coffee store. So let's just print props.coffee store, add a console log in there, just to make sure that it is going to work as intended and it has the data that we need. Does it have all this information there? So let's take a look in our browser and let's open up our browser DevTools. And if you scroll down, you will see props.coffee store. And over here, you can see that we are rendering address. But wait, hold on a second. Notice how address is actually under location and there is no neighborhood. Similarly, there is name and there is image URL, but there is no neighborhood right here. Now, if we go back to home, let's clear this console for a sec and let's click on hot black coffee. Open it up. There is location, there is address, and then there is neighborhood right here. So we do show neighborhood sometimes. So neighborhood looks like it's an optional piece of data, but there is an address each and every time. Now, there's another information right here, which is cross street as well, which we could potentially use if we find that neighborhood doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and fix that, wherein we are actually retrieving address from location instead. Now, if we go back to a component, we can definitely go and fix the coffee store data right here. But there is a easier way where we can do that, wherein we can update our data inside the coffee store library itself. Because remember, we did do that for image URL. So if we go back to our library for coffee stores, and right here towards the bottom, notice how we are transforming data. That is, we are getting the photos as per index and storing it in image URL. And then we are spreading venue right here. So how about we be specific in terms of what we get from venue? So in this case, instead of spreading venue, let's comment it out for a second. And let's be very specific in terms of what we want from venue. So we can say ID, right? What we would like is essentially all these fields. So we can just copy it right here and paste it. Now, along with ID as well. Now we can say that ID is venue.id, right? Then we can say address is actually venue.location.address, right? Then name would be venue.name. For neighborhood, it would be location.neighborhood, right? And let's just make sure that neighborhood that's what it's spelled as. And if you notice that neighborhood has a different spelling right here, so we can just stick to whatever we had and just call neighborhood right here. And this is one of the things with transforming data, that you might have different spellings, or the way you might transform data or call something specific might be different than what you might get from the API. So it's extremely important that we do some sort of data transformation like this, so that the component, the page that is accessing this data, is accessing it consistently throughout your application. Now, let's go back. And lastly, we already have image URL, so we don't need to worry about it. Now, that's it. Now, if you go back to our page, and an ID is not defined, so let's go and fix that. Whoops, we have an extra ID here, so let's save it. And let's go back again. It's refreshing, loading, and it says failed to load static props. So what exactly went wrong? Now, if we go back here, let's just make sure that we are also adding some default values. Because if you notice that some coffee stores had neighborhood and some didn't. So let's just make sure that we have everything. So we can just say or venue.location.cross street, right? Or it's empty. And similarly, we did notice that for address, every coffee store had address. But just in case, we can also add a default here. Now let's hit save and go back. If you refresh the page, it's loading. And it's still not happy with us. So let's go and check what we did wrong. Now let's walk through the code one by one. ID is venue. Oops, so this should be venue.id. Now if you go back, this should work, hopefully, yeah. Let's refresh the page just to make sure. And there you go. And we can see that there's an address and then there is a neighborhood. Now if we go back to home, and let's close this for now. And we say Coffee Culture Cafe. Beautiful. This looks more like a cross street. But I think we are okay with that, right? As long as we know that, okay, give us neighborhood. But if that doesn't exist, give us cross street. But if that doesn't exist, then give us an empty string. And if that happens, then let's make sure that, let's make neighborhood optional altogether. So we can just say that if there is neighborhood, then only render this specific div, right? Because we don't want to render when it doesn't exist, because otherwise it will be an empty icon. It's looking good.